How am I doing, Jack? You ready? Well, good evening. I'm Charles Overby, and I'm the chairman of the Overby Center for Southern Journalism and Politics, and I'm really glad you came tonight. I don't get to come down here as often as I used to, and so it's a real pleasure and thrill for me to be on the Ole Miss campus and see so many bright students here tonight. You know, one of the things we try to do here at the Overby Center is to celebrate excellence. And we have two panelists tonight who represent that excellence in journalism, and particularly proud of having one of our own back. Tony Plahetsky is one of Ole Miss's own, and Tony Peterson is going to introduce him here in a minute. This is the first time we've ever had a program that had two Tonys on it. And they're both Tony the Tigers in my book. Tony Peterson, who's going to moderate and run this program tonight, is the National Fellow of the Overby Center. He was the top editor at the Houston Chronicle, one of the country's top 10 in circulation newspapers when he was running it for many years. And then he went to SMU and was journalism professor and chair there at SMU for a long time. And he just recently retired, and he's been willing to dedicate some of his time to the Overby Center and his work as a National Fellow. Sometimes our programs are fun. Tonight's program is not going to be fun, but it's going to be important. We're going to talk about important issues and where journalism fits into that. So I want to thank you all for coming, and I'm glad to turn the program now over to my friend, Tony Peterson.
Charles, thank you very much. And Charles, you're right. This program is not about much fun, but it is about something that's terribly important. And it's my pleasure to introduce Tony Plahetsky of the Austin American Statesman and also KVUE in Austin, Texas. Tony is a 2000 graduate of the University of Mississippi, and welcome back. Great to have you on campus. If I started reading the awards Tony has won, we'd be here a long time. But I'll just mention a few things. I'll start with the Pulitzer Prize finalist for the gold medal for the Austin American Statesman earlier this year. The gold medal is only awarded to an institution, an organization, and the Austin American Statesman was a finalist among three finalists, and it is a huge honor. The winner of that gold medal, by the way, was the Associated Press for courageous and extraordinary reporting from the war front in Ukraine. So it's big time journalism, and it's important to mention that. Tony's also, just a few weeks ago, given the Star Reporter of the Year in the state of Texas by the Headliners Foundation of Texas. He's won 2 National Headliners Awards, including one for his work on Uvalde. And he's also won the Hillman Prize in Broadcast Journalism for a body of work dealing with police accountability, and that was in 2020. So the list is a long one. And Tony, I'm interested just in a little bit of background because you work for 2 news organizations, not related, not owned by the same company. A generation ago, we wouldn't have even thought of that. Right. And now it's kind of the journalism of the future. How does that work, and how did it come about?
Well, first of all, before I answer your question, Tony, I want to say how honored I am to be here back on campus at Ole Miss. And I just want to thank everyone in the crowd for coming tonight to hear this conversation. But my journalism career in many ways has been different in terms of my trajectory. I left Ole Miss in 2000 and started as a young reporter at the Austin American Statesman. At that time, I was the youngest reporter on staff for a period of several months. I worked there and continue to work there, but in my 13th year, I had the opportunity to begin working in partnership, as you mentioned, with the local ABC station. At that time, it was really something of a pioneering thing that the newspaper and this local television station put in place. The idea is that the work that I was doing for the newspaper, there was this thought that it could be further amplified and reach an even wider audience by also having those stories showcased on a television medium as well. And so I've learned to do television over the past decade while also maintaining my position at the Austin American Statesman. You know, it's interesting, and I was having this conversation today with someone, and when I was in college, you had to choose a track. You either had to choose the newspaper print track or the broadcast track. But what I advise students today is you really just want to focus on being a solid journalist. You want to learn how to ask the right questions, where to get the information, and then figure out the platform, whether or not it's something digital or a traditional newspaper or television or even social media. Journalism is journalism, no matter where you are placing it and where you are broadcasting or printing it.
Great advice, and thank you very much for that. We do want to talk about Uvalde, tragedy that it was, and we're reminded again as we are here tonight, the president has ordered flags at half-staff in memory of those in Lewiston, Maine, with another incident. I want to ask you, Tony, what happened in your newsroom when you got word that there was an active shooter in an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas?
I remember it as though it happened minutes ago, May 24th, 2022. At that point, our newsrooms were still coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. Actually, that day, I was working at home, as I still do from time to time. And an important part of Uvalde geographically is that it is not immediately in our coverage area in Austin. Uvalde is a solid 3 hours door to door from my house to downtown Uvalde. And so, as we do from time to time, unfortunately, we started getting reports, very initial reports in the early afternoon about a shooting at an elementary school. As these things go, sometimes they do not develop into a full scale tragedy and massacre the way that this one unfortunately did. And so we were sort of in a monitoring process for some period of minutes. I mean, we were seeing the initial reports. Um, my editor, the top editor of the Statesman, actually called me and said, "Do you mind helping make some calls and figure out what is happening in Uvalde?" Um, I've been, as we've said, a reporter in Texas for now 24 years, in my 24th year. And so, as part of that, you learn and develop sources, contacts, and different government agencies who you are able to call in a situation like this to hopefully get the truth and find out what's happening. And so, within both the governor's office and the Texas Department of Public Safety, I had sources, contacts there I reached out to. And both of them gave the same number, the same initial number, which was 14 children had been confirmed dead at that point. Um, and that was a real turning point because the number that we had heard initially was 2. And so when you get that kind of information and you recognize the gravity of what you were being told, not only that, we became the first news outlet to raise the death toll from 2 to 14, which carries with it an incredible responsibility because that is nothing you would ever want to get wrong. So in consultation with the top editors I work with, we were the first to report that number. Tragically, as the evening wore on, the number went up to 19 students and 2 teachers. But within 5 minutes of hearing the number 14, I was in the car on the way to Uvalde,
Sure.
knowing what a full-scale tragedy and what a national tragedy this would become. By the way, Tony, students will sometimes ask, how do you distinguish yourself or how do you get ahead in your own career? And one piece of advice I always say, which I lived that day, was you don't wait to be asked to go. You don't let your bosses tell you to go. You say, I'm leaving my house right now. And I was gone literally within minutes.
This guy's just full of great advice for journalism students, so pay attention. I think it might be well to refresh some memories about that school shooting and just some of the basic facts. And I put together a little fact sheet here. It's been well over a year, almost a year and a half. And as we see what had happened, the shooter had an encounter with his grandmother that morning, shot her in the face. She survived after being in the hospital more than a month. And then he took her pickup truck, drove it through a barrier onto the school grounds at Robb Elementary, and then entered the school itself at 11:30 a.m. And the rest is there. And as noted, there were a total of 19 students murdered. They ranged in age from 9 to 11. And we should also never forget there were two teachers who were murdered. This led, of course, to an investigation by the legislature in Texas, and they've issued a full report. You can get that online. And that report concluded that the event represented a complete failure and breakdown of multiple systems, including from law enforcement. And there were several that became clear when this video was secured by Tony and first shown on KView on the afternoon of July 12th.
Right.
And you broke into programming. You were in studio with two anchors. And that video, of course, became a huge part of the story. Let me ask a couple of questions, if I might. It was known pretty early on that there was a video that existed because of the cameras in the school.
Yes. In some ways it was known. We knew that there were videos within the school. We didn't fully grasp the vantage point and frankly, Tony, the quality of the technology. We are now living in a time where I am sure there are security cameras trained on us right now that are in color, digital, high quality, and what I don't think we knew was just the crystal clear images that those cameras were capturing.
When did you begin to work sources to secure the release of that video to you? Because it had been shown to media members.
So,
This is an unusual circumstance that it was shown to you and yet not released. How did that come about?
So the way the story unfolded was really complex. Keep in mind that when we first all descended on Uvalde, we believed we were covering this, and we did in fact cover this, as a monumental, tragic national tragedy, a breaking news story. What quickly became clear to us is that the story was actually two-pronged. There was the shooting, but then there was this secondary story that developed about how law enforcement responded, or in this case, did not adequately respond to what happened. As that story unfolded, I had already deposited a big bank of work in previous years concerning law enforcement accountability. And so I turned my attention to that aspect of the story. Several weeks after the shooting, I was invited by a source, a law enforcement source, who had access to this video. And the invitation was, I want to show you this video, but I'm not giving you a copy of it. I watched the video and frankly it was gut-wrenching to watch. It was incredibly disturbing to watch because what it showed in vivid detail was an army of police officers gathering in the hallway of Robb Elementary School for more than an hour, but not taking action to try to take on this gunman armed with an AR-15 style weapon. Instead, they were walking in the hall, they were trying to talk about how to enter the classroom, and this went on for more than an hour. The source would not allow me, as I mentioned, to have the video, but I did, and this is something where I think my multimedia experience kicked in. Instead of simply taking notes about the video, I convinced the source to at least allow me to take, using my phone, a picture off the screen of his computer. And I shared that on Twitter. It was the first image that showed this army of police officers in the hallway and quickly spread all over the nation. But the truth is, having seen the video, I became more convinced that the world, the nation, the families of Uvalde, the community of Uvalde needed the full picture. They needed to see for themselves with their own eyes and hear with their own ears the contents of this video. So I spent the next several weeks trying to ascertain who had a copy of it and then literally calling every single one of them multiple times um, to try to convince one of them to give me the video. And one Sunday afternoon, again, I remember this detail as though it was yesterday. One Sunday afternoon, Roe, my husband who was here, was cooking dinner, and I looked at him and I said, "I have to go. I can't tell you where I'm going, um, but trust me, I'm telling my bosses where I'm going." And so I went and got the copy of the video that was on a Sunday afternoon, early evening, and as you mentioned, Tony, we published and aired the video Tuesday around 3 o'clock. So about, what is that, 48, 72 hours later.
Tell me why you showed this video on KVU that afternoon as a part of the special report.
Well, let me say, an underpinning of all of this is that in no school shooting or mass shooting that I am aware of, we have never had this kind of detailed information that had been so captured in this way. Um, so we had to confront a number of ethical decisions, really from the moment the video starts. Ultimately, we decided that the public deserved maximum information, more information than not. That the public was entitled to the full truth, and we did, as you mentioned, make some editorial changes, decisions. Say too, as part of the conversation, um, there were public outcries for information, and we've not really gotten into that. But In the aftermath of the shooting, state officials and federal officials told the world and told the community of Uvalde that law enforcement had acted heroically, and but for their swift action, more children would have died in this shooting, but that they bravely and courageously confronted the gunman. And so, as seekers and reporters of truth, once we had information that so spoke in such a contrary way to that and provided the real truth, we also thought that and believed that it was our duty, our journalistic duty and responsibility to bring the truth forward to the world.
To that point, pay attention to the real time in the upper left, which is 11:33. That's the time that the gunman entered the hallway and you heard the initial shots. Law enforcement, this is a screenshot, not a video. Law enforcement entered that same hallway about 3 minutes later, and you see, and I have a couple of other screenshots. This is 11:36, 12:30, almost an hour later, and you see again more law enforcement. And as this is going on, by the way, this entire video, it's more than an hour. You can see it on YouTube, download it. The officers are, some of them are on cell phones, they're texting. There's even one part of the video in which an officer goes over and uses the hand sanitizer that you see on the wall. So,
But importantly, Tony, and this image shows it well, I think, you see that they are donned in all sorts of protective gear. They have ballistic shields. They themselves have high powered weapons. And what any law enforcement expert will tell you is that with this number of officers and with this firepower, they had more than enough to take on the gunman far sooner than they did.
as you watch the video, and certainly I still react the same way, and even looking at this screenshot, you just want to say, kick the door down, go in there and shoot the guy. And it finally did happen. This is 12:45, 15 minutes later, and you see even more. And Tony's right. They have high-powered weapons. They have military-style vests. They have ballistic shields. And it was another 5 minutes. It was at 12:50 when I believe it was Border Patrol agents
That's correct.
went in and ended the situation by killing the shooter. And interesting to note that the chief of the Uvalde police force, his name was Pete Arredondo, spent, according to testimony, some 40 minutes looking for a key to unlock the door that, as I understand it, wasn't locked in
They
the
now
first
believe
place.
it was not locked in the first place.
And Arredondo treated the situation as what is referred to as a barricaded suspect rather than an active shooter situation.
Correct.
And when you had all of this information, I think the journalism of it was very sound and it showed very clearly. At what point, looking back, May 24th, at what point did your reporting indicate that maybe law enforcement was not telling you the right stuff?
That was an insane week, if I can just really be honest. I mean, you're dealing with this epic tragedy of monumental proportion and heartbreak and shock. Um, and early on, I would say within the first 24 to 48 hours, we began seeing these social media videos of parents who had descended onto the school to try to check on their children, rescue their children, pick up their children, whatever the case may be, who were being held away from the school by law enforcement, and they were screaming, "Get in there and get my kids! What's going on?" And so there were indications pretty early that something was not right. I mean, the parents had this very strong idea very early on that the response was not as it should have been. By Thursday of that week, Texas Department of Public Safety began indicating that there may have been a problem with the response. They really could not account for in their timeline. The gunman entered the school at 11:38. We took down the gunman at 12:53. I mean, I'm sorry to ask the question in this way, but the obvious question was, well, what the hell happened for an hour and 15 minutes?
In his,
And we were asking that question and not really getting, frankly, a straight answer.
well, in his testimony later, Colonel Steve McGraw, who's the head of the Department of Public Safety in Texas, said that the law enforcement effort was, and I quote, an abject failure. And he was quoted as saying, "I don't care if you have flip-flops and Bermuda shorts, you go in." And that didn't happen. And you have seen the timeline, and you've seen what did happen. The video itself was posted online, and the reporting continued. And once that happened, of course, there was a strong reaction from at least some of the parents about the posting of the video. And here's some of that reaction that went viral.
We're angry. We're very angry. And we want justice for our kids. And for this to be let out without us even being seen first, we're the parents that lost our children. We're supposed to do this together first, not for the world. We're suffering, and I know the world is suffering too, but these were our babies that were taken from us. So to the person that leaked it, screw you. Screw you, and that's coming from me, Felicia Martinez.
From us.
From all of us, screw you.
And I think anybody can have sympathy, and I know you did.
100%,
But
yes.
at the same time, the journalism had to be done. And you had a situation in which law enforcement and a number of public officials had told you information that simply was not factual.
Was not factual, yes.
And if this is a classic example of holding accountability powerful governmental agencies and public officials, and you had no choice.
And I want to say that she is 100% correct. The parents and the family should have been shown this video before the world was shown the video. Law enforcement and the officials had a responsibility that they failed to meet, not only on the day that this happened, when they didn't go in the classroom for more than an hour, but also allowing for weeks to pass without any direct communication from them to the parents to tell them, to provide the truth to them about what happened. And so, frankly, I think it was the role of journalists and journalism to step in and get that truth, to provide it to them.
Now, one of the primary objectors to releasing the video was the district attorney in Uvalde County. And he claimed, as is often the case, that it was an ongoing investigation. And every Open Records Act in the United States has that as an exemption, and it's often used and frankly abused very many times.
Used to hide.
It's used to hide, and certainly was in this case, because they knew what the ultimate accountability was going to be. And what happened afterward in terms of the backtracking of public officials? Pete Arredondo, the chief of police of the school district, was terminated. And I'm always curious,
um, here in Mississippi, Tylertown, Mississippi, population 1,900. And I'll never forget arriving in Sutherland Springs, Texas, which is a town about that size, and really taking in the reality that none of us is immune to this kind of violence, whether we are on a college campus like Ole Miss or in our hometowns in a small country church like in Sutherland Springs or at an elementary school in South Texas. So I think there's a shock that I will never get over, but I also think just the desperateness among those who are directly touched in those early hours to find out what happened, whether or not their loved ones is among the living or the dead. Um, that is just something that I will never get used to, and frankly don't want to get used to. I remember Sutherland Springs. I got there very early on, within maybe 3 hours after the shooting, and a woman coming up to me and saying, do you have any names?" And I didn't. And she said, "I'm trying to find out about my father." And I said, "Well, what's your father's name?" And I wrote it down, wrote his name down. And then when the names of the victims was released, her father was one of the names. And just I still think about her to this day. That was in 2017, and I still think about that moment and her desperateness and her yearning for information, and unfortunately not being able to provide information to her. But the front row seat that we have to journalists is such an honor and so important, but it also does place us at a really terrible center of tragedy at times.
Do you have any thoughts about the motive that the killer had, Salvador Ramos, 18 years old?
Not, no, I mean, not really. The investigations have shown that he clearly had planned this. He attempted to buy a gun before his 18th birthday. And when I say gun, I mean an assault rifle, and was not able to do that. It's something that he had clearly been planning. There was information that he may have been the victim of teasing or bullying at that elementary school as a child. Um, and as we cover these tragedies and these mass shootings, certainly the information about the motive of the gunman and why he chose to do it is a part of our coverage. Um, but we've also worked really hard over time to ensure that the biggest lens of our coverage is on the victims and their lives and their deaths.
So, one final question, and then we will get to your questions, and there are microphones on either side here. So, if you ask a question, and please do ask questions, come to the microphone so that we can capture the audio for the video that we will post. But the final question is, there are journalism students here who may well find themselves covering law enforcement because typically a young reporter is hired by a news organization and you cover cops and courts. What advice do you have?
Which, by the way, is the best job.
It's where I started. And what advice do you have for a student in a first job covering law enforcement?
I think that whether or not you're covering law enforcement or city government or county government or whatever your assignment is at any news organization, particularly as a young journalist, is to just work your tail off. I mean, that's what I did, and be willing to do anything and cover anything. There is no such thing as a bad assignment. Um, but I think a willingness to involve yourself in coverage. Again, when the Dallas police shootings happened in 2016, another huge national story. I called my bosses and said, "I don't know what your coverage plans are, but if you need me, I'll be in Dallas." And I think just stepping up and stepping out as needed. I also have other pieces of advice too around source building and making sure that you are developing contacts who will help lead you to good stories in your community or on your beat. Um, but mostly, I think a willingness to involve yourself in the work in a big way is a key piece of advice.
Good advice. We have a question.
A couple.
Oh. Over here, please. Oh, you're running mics. I'm sorry.
Hi. Oh,
Yes.
hi.
Okay.
Hey, thank you for coming. Such
Yeah,
an
thank you
important
so
subject.
much.
I write for Newsweek, and after the Uvalde shooting, they asked me to write an essay on this group called KnowNotoriety.com. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but after the Aurora shootings, the parents were outraged that the kids' names were released because they thought it would create copycats. And then when this Umpqua Community College shooting happened, here's what the shooter posted before he shot and killed people. By the way, these shooters don't wear masks. They don't hide. And these parents think these are mass shooters, suicides. But here's what the post was. He said, "A man who was known by no one is now known by everyone. His face splashed across newspapers across the country. Sometimes the more people you kill, the more you're in the limelight." How much is the press responsible in terms of naming the names of these people for creating perhaps the copycat?
I think that's a very important question, and I think it's one that we are increasingly mindful and cognizant of in this moment of the proliferation. It's more than a moment; it is a proliferation of mass shootings. Um, Editorially, with the organizations that I work for, we used the shooter's name very sparingly and in very deliberate ways. So, for example, if it spoke to uh, any information about his motive or his effort to maybe buy the gun, we did so in that way. But we are absolutely mindful about not wanting to do anything to glorify a mass shooter or to show the next one. Well, one way that you will receive national attention is, or worldwide attention, is to carry out something like this. So it is a topic and a conversation that I think journalism is having across the nation. And I think, for the record, I think it's the right one to have.
A question right here, but can we get, you have a microphone? Yes, please.
Hi, Sparky.
Hey, Tony. Tony, it's clear that this takes a toll on a journalist. What type of services are provided post-event for journalists to deal with this? And that's the first question. The second question is, what experiences as a student journalist did you have that might have prepared you for doing these things?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for asking that question. The topic of mental health and journalism is one that, similar to your question, is very much part of the conversation now, and I'm thankful for it. You know, when I entered my career as a young journalist, that was not something that was really readily discussed. I can remember in 2005 wading the streets of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina and seeing the devastation that was brought by the hurricane, and really having some PTSD associated with it. And the attitude at that time, and what was that, maybe 15, 17 years ago, that was not part of the conversation in the journalism industry. It is a very different story now, where mental health counselors are brought in to talk to entire staffs. As information, as journalists are now going through information, for example, autopsy reports and viewing autopsy photos, really graphic information, that there are efforts to engage with mental health professionals Bosses now, I think, editors, news managers are far more aware of the toll that this work takes on for their staff, for their journalists, and are mindful about making sure that they have time off, that they have time to decompress. I think that's really important because, unfortunately, these things keep happening, and with no end in sight, it's really critical that we all take care of ourselves so that we are ready to face whatever comes our way next.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Okay. Hello.
Hi.
Yes.
Hi. So you mentioned earlier that you made edits to the video that was published. What were those edits, and what was the thought process as you were editing the video?
So once we had the video, again, I mentioned that we wanted to provide the greatest amount of transparency. The two edits that we made is that, and you saw in the video we showed, there was a little boy who emerged from the bathroom right after the gunman walked in and was walking down the hall. You could see vividly the little boy's face, and so we blurred his face so that he could not be identified. That child, by the way, was rescued more than an hour later by police officers. With regard to the parents, while we did hear from clearly a number of parents who were upset and angry at us, we made attempts to contact as many parents as we could prior to publishing and airing this video. One of the parents had a request that was just kind of a broad statement, which was a supportive statement around the release of the video, but ended their comment with, "We just don't want to hear the final screams and the cries of our children." And to that end, you could hear some screaming on the video. And so we edited that out because the last thing we would want is for that sound to have been identifiable to a grieving loved one. And those were the two.
Next question, please. Yes, in the back.
How do you go about what you report in terms of a situation like this? Say the police chief, after a situation like this, talks to the press for an hour. What do you take from a situation that after he speaks, what do you take and what do you say, I'm going to talk about this in my press and I'm not going to use this? And maybe the same thing with family and relatives. Maybe you talk to 30 parents. What do you choose to use and what do you choose not to? What is the process behind that situation?
Well, that's part of what we do as journalists on any story, right? Is that we go out into the world and we interview people on any given topic, and then we bring to bear our skills and make determinations around what is most of public interest, what is most factual, and we make those kinds of determinations and bring that forward to the public. So not everything everyone says is quote unquote newsworthy. But in situations with law enforcement, I just want to say this as well, and that is over time, journalists have relied on law enforcement in most instances, particularly in big breaking news events, to be sort of the narrator of fact. And that is a dynamic that has definitely shifted in journalism over the past several years, particularly post George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, when we now know that the Minneapolis Police Department did not give an accurate portrayal of what happened to George Floyd. And so, much like any official or any account that anyone gives us, we always, in addition to trying to assess what is newsworthy and what is of public interest, we also have a responsibility, particularly when we're talking about official accounts of things, to fact check that as much as we can and to verify it. And so things that we then take forward to the public hopefully are things that we've been able to verify through our own reporting, getting additional sources, talking to additional people who maybe saw or heard what happened.
Next question, please. Yes?
Hey.
Hi.
Okay, so what good or any changes came about because of your reporting, either within the county or within the state, regarding law enforcement within school districts or, the greater state area?
Oh, thank you for that question, because it was also when we were doing our decision making with regard to the video, that was one of the points that was considered as well, is could this information potentially stop law enforcement from responding this way and prompt them to respond in a better or more appropriate way. With regard to law enforcement training, I think that watching this video became something of a training tool for police agencies across the nation about what not to do in an active shooter situation. And frankly, we saw that happen with the Covenant School in Nashville earlier this year, where unlike in Uvalde, when they waited more than an hour to take action, at the Covenant School in Nashville, we saw body camera video from cops showing up at that school, entering the school, immediately tracking down that shooter and stopping the shooter.
Good point. Other questions, please? Yes?
Sorry, it went to the next page. You have discussed how to deal with the information before and after you receive it, but how do you handle your composure and emotions during the interviews of tragic events like this?
I think the best you can, but to be clear, we're also all human here. And I think that you may not want to lose it when you are on the air or talking to a parent or interviewing someone whose family member has died in a tragic situation. But I think also it's important for us to connect with the people that we are covering and to show that we are empathetic people and that we care about them on a really human level. So I don't know that there's a rule that you have to necessarily not let your own emotion come through. I think that people connect with emotion, and I think it's important that we be ourselves, and perhaps that's most important, is that we be ourselves. And if we're feeling sad or deeply moved by something, I think it's appropriate to acknowledge that.
Next question, please. Yes, in the middle. Yep, go ahead.
Yes, you mentioned that you had spoken to some of the families of the victims. Did any of them know that you were the one who released video and got video? And if they knew, what was their direct response to you, specifically?
Yeah, so I want to clarify what I meant by that when I said we. I the way we sort of divvied assignments is that in both newsrooms, while I was doing a lot of work related to law enforcement accountability, some of my other colleagues were having more direct relationships and ongoing reporting with family members. Over time, I have done some of that myself, but in that moment, colleagues were handling the direct contact with those family members. Again, some of them we were not able to reach. Some of them were supportive. I don't recall anyone in that moment asking us not to release the video. But again, I was not having that kind of interaction, that level of interaction with family members.
Next
Over
question.
over time, if I can just add, over time we have seen many of the families develop voices of advocacy and activism, and have absolutely become more open uh, to media interviews and contact by the media. But at the point that this was all happening with regard to the video, it was still pretty early, only about 6 weeks from the day of the shooting, and so those relationships were still getting developed at that point as well.
Yes, but hold on for a mic.
The national media, of course, descended on Uvalde.
Yes.
Did they bully you or say, we'll take over from here? Well, how did you relate to the national media?
Well, that's a good question as well, because what we saw in Uvalde, what I saw in Sutherland Springs, and this is actually a conversation in journalism too, much like showing and naming shooters, the mental health of journalists, and that is in a small town like Sutherland Springs or Uvalde. Does every journalist in America need to go to that town? And how many is too many? How many journalists are too many journalists? Um, what I've learned over time is that when there is a major something happen in a community like this, the networks have logistics people who in an instant call and book every hotel room. And so in Uvalde, we had people sleeping in cars. I was fortunate enough to get a Motel 6 room. My first night, they did not leave the light on for me. But with regard to your question more specifically, the truth is, I think the national media actually did, not everyone, but I do think there were some national media journalists who did very important and revealing work in Uvalde, and absolutely earned their place in the town. There's also, a stereotype that I think holds at times too, which is the national media parachutes in. They don't really give a hoot about the town, that they're just there for their, 24, 48, 72 hours. And then they leave, and they tear up people's lawns with their tents and whatever. But again, in Uvalde, I think that it was the collective work of journalists locally, and when I say locally, I'm talking about from the local Uvalde newspaper. I interviewed their publisher a couple of weeks ago, to statewide news outlets, to national news outlets. And I think that working together collectively, journalism helped bring the full truth of what happened.
Maybe we're close to the end, but another question? Another question? Yes, over here.
Well, I have a question because in Maui, we still haven't got all that information out. And I'm just wondering if it's because, like Uvalde, they were brown-skinned people. And I kind of feel that that is an issue partially there. With the police officers, I have a question. They, as a small town, they probably knew that this individual had some mental illness, but could they really do anything about it? Because in my understanding of the system is that unless they have a court order or somebody gives them up or, asks for them to be incarcerated in a mental institution, they have their hands tied. And with Parkview, my understanding was that they knew about this individual, but again, because they had their hands tied, but also because there was a standing order that that kind of individual was not to be interfered with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are all important policy questions that I think as a nation we continue to confront. People will often, I think, wonder whether or not journalism moves into some sort of activism or advocacy, around these types of issues, and whether or not by reporting so extensively on and aggressively on Uvalde, whether or not we are trying to attempt to drive a conversation about what government officials should do with regard to gun control or mental health. And I think it's important that we as journalists know what our mission is and our job is and where our job starts and stops. And as I see it, our job is to bring the truth to the public, to everyone, all of the stakeholders, and allow that information to drive the discussion and drive the debate. And to that end, family members, parents from Uvalde did work very hard to engage lawmakers both at the state and federal level in that conversation. And while we covered it, it was certainly not our job to join in that conversation with them. I believe that's where our job as journalists stops.
And it looks like the mental health issue will be another significant portion of the shooting in Maine and what had gone on before. Tony Poletsky, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.